we use in all our work in ontology in Buffalo, and is now being used by a lot of people outside Buffalo as a basic framework for building ontologies. I'm going to start where I left off in the previous class, where we were talking about two kinds of predication, and this is a distinction which it's important to associate with Aristotle. You'll see why this is an important distinction in a minute. I'll just explain the distinction first of all. There are two ways in which we can predicate things. One is, in Aristotle's terms, predication in the category of substance, and what that means is that we say what kind of thing a thing is. So John is a man, Fido is a dog, this electron is an electron, this arm waving is a process. These are all predications in the category of substance in the relevant sense. And then there are predications in the category of accident. Now what that means is that you can't change your kind. You cannot become an electron or a number or a banana. But you can change your temperature. So your temperature is, in Aristotle's terms, an accident of you. And you may or may not be running, but you can certainly change whether you're running. So these kinds of predications, John is running, John has diabetes, these are predications in the category of accident. Now, to do ontology, we need both kinds of predications. And in fact, we need more than just these two kinds of predications, but we need to distinguish between these two kinds of predications because we want to say things about John's temperature, and we want to say things about John's diseases and so forth, and about John's behavior, the processes in which John is engaging. So we need to have not only John as being an entity that we can talk about, but also the features or attributes of John. Now the reason why that's important is because if we're approaching ontology from an Aristotelian point of view, we're going to have four possible kinds of entity. We're going to have things, we're going to have accidents or attributes or qualities. We'll find a better terminology for the bottom right-hand corner very soon. And then we're going to have kinds, which in Aristotelian speak are sometimes called universals. The things and the attributes at the bottom are instances of the kinds at the top. So John is an instance of the kind man, and my headache is an instance of the kind headache. Instance, particular, individual, these are all words for the stuff on the bottom, and universal, kind, type, class, species, genus, these are all words for the stuff on the top. And we need all four boxes to be populated. Now, Frege was the inventor of modern logic. So Aristotle invented logic. 2,000 years later, Frege invented modern logic. And really they are the two most important figures in the history of logic. The logic that people do today, the logic which was at the basis of modern computer languages, the logic that mathematicians use, is all logic in the style of Frege. For Frege, there is no difference between predication in the category of substance and predication in the category of accident. They're all written in the same way. F holds of A. So John is a man becomes man holds of John, and John is hungry becomes hungry holds of John. That's the way modern logic works. Now you can express the distinction between those two kinds of predication using modern logic, and we'll be doing some of that. But most people don't, because they think in the Fregean way. They see the world in terms of F holds of A. And I wrote a paper pointing out that this was not necessarily a good thing, because we're losing an important distinction here. And the paper was called Against Phantology. Phantology is ontology, but it's done with one hand and both legs tied behind your back, because you have a narrow worldview. And this is the worldview of standard predicate logic. We have attributes, which are sort of in the top row on the right, and we have individuals, which are always in the bottom row on the left. So we don't have universals such as man or ox or even headache. We have universals such as red, or maybe not even red. Maybe we have an even thinner ontology. But the universals are on the side, the general is on the side of the general words in language, such as red, hungry, and so forth. Some people embrace headaches and redness as entities, and so they have both particulars under the heading of substance or thing or object, and particulars under the heading of accident or attribute or property. So they really do believe in headaches, but they think that headaches are entities rather than a predicate has headache. And so this is a view of the world which is nowadays also commonly accepted, but this is the view which is imposed upon many people by the syntax of modern logic. And now there are some people who just think that there are processes, and they are nominalists in the sense that they don't believe in kinds. They just believe that the realm of kinds or types or universals is dealt with by names, hence nominalism. The only things which exist for nominalists are particulars. Some people think that the only things which exist are particular processes. So there are no headaches, there are just headachings. There are no people, there are just Bill Clintonizing processes. And again, there are some people who embrace this process nominalism view, but we embrace a four-category ontology, which includes particulars, both particular things and particular moments, features, attributes, and types of things and types of moments, features, attributes, and so on. And just to anticipate, the moments, features, attributes depend on the things instantiate the kinds, the thing kinds, and the moments, attributes, features instantiate the moment, attribute, feature kinds, and the things exemplify the features. So if this cell has a sickle shape, it exemplifies the sickle shape. But it has a specific, particular sickle shape, which only it has. And now, are there any questions? All right, so I'm going to assume that that is all intelligible. You'll get more of it soon. All right, so we talked in the last class about the gene ontology. The gene ontology is divided into three sub-ontologies, which are cellular component ontology, molecular function ontology, and biological process ontology. Cellular components correspond, roughly speaking, to things. So the nucleus is a thing, the mitochondrion is a thing, the membrane is a thing. Molecular functions we haven't talked about, but they belong in the family of attributes in the sense I was just talking about. So the molecular function of binding to another molecule, for instance. The function of this protein is to bind to molecules of this kind. And then biological processes are things like death as a process, dying. Now, that means that there are three most general terms within the gene ontology. Now, BFO was created in part as a reverse engineering of the gene ontology. If we wanted to have the architecture of the gene ontology generalized so that it would apply not merely to the biological phenomena which correspond to gene product attributes, which is what the gene ontology was designed for, what would be the three categories, the three universals, the three kinds which would be at the very top? Well, they would be what in BFO terms are called independent continuants And I'll explain what that means in a minute. And then corresponding to the attributes would be what BFO calls dependent continuance, and corresponding to the processes would be what BFO calls occurrence. So this is the top-level architecture of BFO. And these are just more examples. So objects, parts of objects are independent continuance, qualities, roles, and functions are dependent continuance, and processes, beginnings, ends, operations, activities, events, happenings are all occurrence. So if we go back to the ontological square, remember we said that we defend a 4-category ontology. In fact, BFO defends a 6-category ontology. 3 times 2 is 6. So the 3 top-level terms of the gene ontology become the 3 top-level terms of BFO, and then BFO recognizes both universals in these 3 categories and particulars. So object universal would be Homo sapiens, object instance would be me, dependent continuant universal would be shape, and then the dependent continuant instance would be my shape, and a process universal would be hand waving, and a process instance would be the hand waving which I just performed. And we can now extend our pattern from a few minutes ago. So now we have 3 kinds of entities which are instantiating 3 kinds of universals. These are the things in the world that we see, touch, experiment with, and so on. And these are the types which science is interested in. So when you write a scientific theory, you don't care about instances. But when you perform an experiment, you have to experiment on instances. And you're trying to infer general rules which apply to all instances of a given type. All right, now there is more to BFO than just the 3 top-level terms which I just mentioned. And so under independent continuant we have material entity. Under dependent continuant we have qualities, dispositions, and roles. And then what we do is we have a few more subdivisions. So there are 3 kinds of material entity: objects, and then these other things. There are immaterial entities such as the interior of this room, which is not made of molecules, but which is a part of reality. There are qualities, there are roles, there are dispositions, and then there are various kinds of temporal regions and various kinds of spatial regions. That's it. That's the ontology. I think there are now 37, I guess I should know that number, 37 nodes in this graph. And these are all the ISA relations connecting these nodes.
But you should connect the right hand side.
Oh yes, sorry. Yeah, so that those two arrows here should point here. All right, and then we use BFO to create other ontologies. So we take the terms we need in BFO and add certain terms for mental functions, mental functioning such as planning or thinking or learning, and we create the mental functioning ontology. We did that now for hundreds of ontologies. And the advantage of BFO is that because it's very small and because it evolves very slowly, it can be used by hundreds of different groups in order to achieve a certain degree of interoperability between the ontologies that they build. It's completely domain neutral, so you can apply it to every domain, which is not true of the gene ontology, obviously. If you have a domain neutral ontology, then it can serve as a backplane or a leverage to create interoperability, because everyone can use it. Every ontology can use BFO. It has a very active and sometimes overly aggressive user forum. It has a lot of people who use it. Some of those people know how to use it, and the ones who do know how to use it can use it in different areas because it's domain neutral. So they can get jobs and then get more jobs when the first jobs are done because they have this portable expertise. And there is a list here of all the various ontologies that we know of anyway, that we're allowed to talk about, which use BFO. And I'm now writing a plan to create a suite of ontologies for the entire Navy based on BFO. Everything that the Navy does, both on the sea and under the sea and in the air, because of course the Navy has aircraft carriers, and in space. All right, and we wrote a book which is a handbook to building ontologies with basic formal ontology, and now you can, soon anyway, you will be able to read this book in Chinese. Now, BFO being used by a lot of users has a very positive feature in that the more users an ontology has, the more valuable the ontology becomes, because the ontologies are used to tag or annotate data. And we'll see more about that in the course of the semester. But if lots of people have already annotated their data using a BFO conformant ontology, and then you use the same ontology to tag your data, then the original data becomes more valuable because it's now linked to the new data. Your data becomes more valuable because it's linked to the existing data, but the ontology becomes valuable because it's now linked to more data. So you get a virtuous circle, a snowball effect, if you like. And that the more valuable the data becomes, the more people become interested in the ontology, and the more valuable the ontology becomes. So this presupposes that the ontology, which is becoming more valuable through this virtuous cycle, is itself capable of being reused. And not all ontologies are capable of being reused. In fact, most ontologies are not capable of being reused. By reused, I mean reused by others. Because most ontologies are built to go hand in hand with a certain body of data and with a certain project. So they are local project specific, or if you like, application ontologies, which are what the ontologies that people, ever since the beginning of ontology, have, I mean in the modern sense, have been building. So this, if we were still listing principles of ontology building, then this would be a principle, namely, don't build an ontology to annotate or tag the data you have, because then the ontology will be useless to any other body of data. Use an ontology to represent the entities which your data are about. And then anyone who has data about the same or similar entities will have the opportunity to use your ontology. And so an ontology which is designed to be reused in this way is called a reference ontology. And BFO is the top level, it's designed to be the top level reference ontology. Now, another key to ontology success is that, or let's say, put it the other way around, another way in which an ontology can fail is if it overlaps with another ontology which is already in general use. So if you create an ontology, well, I'll give you a specific example. There is an ontology called prov, which is short for provenance. And it's an ontology which has terms which are used to describe the provenance of of specific data artifacts, for instance. Where did this document come from? Who wrote it? What is the evidence for it? Those kinds of information. It's a useful body of terms to have if you're interested in document provenance. But the provenance ontology has its own top-level terminology with words like entity and act and so forth, which it defines in its own peculiar way. Now, that means that the provenance ontology consists of two parts. Terms which are specific to the realm of provenance and terms which are completely general. But those completely general terms that they use are different from the terms that on the same completely general level used in other ontologies, which means that already anybody who tries to use prov is going to face conflicts, because terms like entity and activity are used in many other ontologies, but in different ways. Now, that means that there is no modularity here. Prov is trying to have the whole universe because it wants an ontology of provenance, where instead prov should say, well, I'm interested in provenance, I'm going to take a top-level ontology, and it doesn't have to be BFO, but it should be BFO. I'm going to take a top-level ontology which is already well-tested and well-established, and then all the people who are familiar with that top-level ontology will be able to use provenance without having to rejig the ways in which provenance terms are defined, because at the moment they're defined in terms of our local meanings, strange meanings as it happens, for words like activity or entity. So the key to success is not to do that. If you want an ontology of provenance, just build the ontology for provenance terms and take anything else from other established ontologies. And this means also that those other established ontologies, if they're established and recognized and accepted, were probably built and are probably being maintained by authorities in the corresponding domains. You are an authority on provenance, so you get to build the provenance ontology. You don't get to build, for instance, the top-level ontology. And the more we associate ontologies with experts, the more the ontologies are likely to be maintained by people who know what they're talking about, who have an interest in making sure that the ontology is maintained and in making sure that the ontology survives. Because another characteristic flaw in ontologies is that they die when the funding runs out. And that's not good, because you can't use a dead internet page. And most ontologies disappear down the dead internet page hole after 3 or 4 years. So giving experts ownership gives them motivation to keep the ontology alive. The fact they're alive for a long time means that they're easily discoverable because they're all over the internet. And also having modularity supports another key to ontology success, which means that you can build an ontology in increments. If you have to build the ontology all at once, and if it has to cover everything, then you're going to have a big problem, because you will have no place to start. Moreover, if you have successful modularity, you don't need to worry about mappings. So everyone who uses prov has to worry about mapping the top-level ontology of prov, which is used in all the definitions in prov, with the top-level ontology that they already are using, because prov did not pay attention to modularity. If prov had paid attention to modularity, people wouldn't have that issue. All right, any questions or problems? Okay, so the hub and spokes approach gives you the kind of modularity that is needed in the ontology world. It's not simple modularity where you have 12 modules, all of which are like the squares on a chessboard. You can't do ontology that way, because there are more general ontologies which are presupposed by less general ontologies. So what you need is a hub and spokes approach, or more precisely, a hub and spokes of spokes, ... approach. And the hub should be BFO. So now there are a number of ontology frameworks, including this one, which is maintained in Buffalo by the Kubrick ontology team. This is a very wide-ranging collection of ontologies for things like the geospatial realm, time, measurement, agents, and so forth. And it has many ontologies which extend downwards from it, and which are used, for instance, in various military ontology efforts. So these are some examples of extension ontology. So an ethnicity ontology, a citizenship ontology, a sensor ontology, an undersea warfare ontology, and so forth. And then you see the hub is green, the mid-level reference ontologies are blue, and the extension ontologies, some of which may be for specific purposes, specific projects, specific data, some of which may still be generic enough to be widely reused, they are in light blue at the bottom. And the principles for building such hub and spokes ontologies we published in this paper in 2007, and it's been most successfully applied in biology. And that's one of the reasons why we're here, because of the success of the oboe foundry approach. And this is another way of looking at the oboe foundry. So we have BFO at the top, we have various mid-level ontologies, and then we have the phenotype ontology, the environment ontology, and so forth. And the way it happened is the gene ontology already existed, and the gene ontology is down here at the bottom left under molecule, it's in the middle on the left under cellular component, and then at bottom in the middle molecular function, and then over on the right in the top two boxes we have organism level and cellular processes. They correspond to the gene ontology, biological process ontology. So we started with the gene ontology, but then we saw that there were gaps. Where does the disease ontology go? Where does chemistry go? Where does anatomy go? And so we divided the ontologies according to granularity on the vertical axis, and then according to BFO on the horizontal axis. And now we've been doing similar things in other areas. And gradually we added to that. So this was in around 2002. We added ontologies for population level entities, which are bigger than organisms. And we added an environment ontology. And the environment ontology is primarily about systems of various kinds, biomes, ecological systems, habitats. And we'll talk about certain other additions to this framework in a few minutes. And so the idea is that the hub and spokes starts at the very top with the most general terms, and then we use an A as a B which sees definition template to build downwards. So you always need a parent term. You start with the parent, which is B, with BFO, and you want to define an information artifact. Well, an information artifact is a generically dependent continuant which is about something, where generically dependent continuant is a BFO term, which we will meet in a minute. And then you're down here, and then you want a term to be defined which is more specific than information artifact. For instance, information artifact which is about a cell. And that you define that term, cell information artifact is a information artifact about a cell. And now you're using the cell ontology to create a definition using the information artifact ontology. And so each step takes you further down in the hierarchy of the more general and the more particular. All right, so back to BFO, and that's just the color scheme. Now the basis of all of this, I said, was that you don't build ontologies to describe data, you build ontologies to describe the entities in reality which those data are about. And that is called ontological realism. And Werner and I published a paper called Ontological Realism, which describes how we do it, why we do it, and what happens if you don't do it. One idea behind ontological realism is that there are different perspectives on the same reality which may be equally true. For instance, I can have a perspective on Werner as an angry Belgian, or I can have a perspective on Werner as a collection of cells. or a collection of molecules. All of those perspectives can be equally correct. They're just at different levels of granularity. Another perspective is the perspective which distinguishes between what we call the Stokes perspective and what we can call the flows perspective. So I can view Werner as something which exists, which I can store in a warehouse or sell or rent. But I can also view Werner from the flows perspective, and I can see Werner as an energy flow, or as an oxygen flow, or as a collection of metabolic processes. And that is an equally valid perspective. There are all kinds of things which are true about what happens to energy when it moves through the Werner spatial region. So BFO allows both a Stokes perspective and a flows perspective, and a combination perspective. The reason why we need to point this out is that there are some philosophical approaches to ontology which only allow one or the other of those perspectives. So process metaphysics, which I referred to earlier, only allows the flows perspective. It doesn't recognize objects, it only recognizes processes. All right. So what ontologies do is they represent reality, but their ontologies are only interested in the universals in reality, or the kinds, or the types. That's what we do. That's what makes an ontology an ontology. And so we can think of BFO as being a representation of these universals, but each of these universals has many instances. So Werner is an instance of the universal independent continuant. And Werner's present scratching of his cheek is an instance of the universal process. And we can take either an inventory approach, and then we count the instances. So when you take an inventory of your warehouse, you're just counting all the instances of dust collector fans that you have in your warehouse. But when you build a catalog, you're just interested in the type, dust collector fan. So an ontology is like a catalog, where databases are like inventories. Now, the relation between universals and instances can be captured set theoretically. So if you have a universal, then there will be a class of the particulars which instantiate that universal. So and that's called the extension of the universal. So the extension of the universal human being is the population of the planet. And now there's a question. Do we mean the population of the planet over all time? Or do we mean the population of the planet now? Which is a subset, a proper subset of the population of the planet over all time. And I'm not going to give you the answer to that question. I'm just going to tell you that there is a question. And I said before that science is interested in universals because science is interested in generalizations, where most databases are about particulars. People do collect databases about protein types, for instance, but they are really ontologies. And we've seen that picture before, I believe. We've seen that picture. We've seen that. Well, I just mentioned that chapter 4 gives you rules for definitions. Not just the A is a B which C's, but other rules which will help you. And rules for formulating terms in ontologies. And one such rule is that when you're building an ontology, what you should use is exclusively singular nouns. So another mistake that people have often made when building ontologies is that they have mixed singulars and plurals. And so we get, in the mesh, it's not really an ontology, but it's a very commonly used list of medical subject headings organized hierarchically. They have the equivalent of socialism is our political systems, because they mixed singular and plural. So if they just used plural everywhere, then they would have socialism is a political system, which sounds better. And it's an easy rule to follow, but people don't always follow it. If they did, we would have a little bit of extra harmony in the world. Now, you can take photographs of instances. You can't take photographs of types, but you can draw cartoons of types. And so cartoons can be annotated, and when they're annotated, then you annotate them with ontology terms. But you can also annotate images with ontology terms. It's just that you can't photograph images. All right, so that's the background to BFO. I'm now going to start talking about BFO itself, and I'll do a quick run through of the BFO history, and then talk about why BFO should be used rather than Dolce or one of the other top-level ontologies. So are there any questions about what I've said so far? Yes?
I just had a question about the extension of the universal.
Yeah.
So when you define terms, we're not defining terms by the extension of the universal.
No, that would be a mistake. So you could define, so boson, for instance, you could define a boson as being either a Higgs boson or a Fermi, or I don't know, there are 8 kinds, quark, and so forth. But that would not be a good definition, because they might discover a new kind of boson, and then all the work on bosons would have to be changed because they all use the wrong definition. So, and a similar problem arises if you have terms which include in their definitions words like other.
Right.
So we talked about that in the first class.
Yeah, just a question and perhaps clarification that is needed for your perspectives.
Yes.
So, if you have the perspective that from the process metaphysics, so people who see, when they look at me, they see the moving of the energy.
Yeah.
But for them, it would be wrong to say that I am.
Oh, absolutely.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they couldn't refer to you.
Exactly.
They would just see it. So when people claim to be process metaphysicians, particularly in medical context, I like to say, well, you see a doctor. First of all, if they could see a doctor, then they would be cured of their process metaphysics. Secondly, the fact that they embrace process metaphysics proves that they need to see a doctor. All right. So BFO 1.0 started in around 2002. It was first presented to the public from the University of the Saarland in Saarbrücken, which is where I was working at that time in an institution called IFOMIS, which is the Institute for Formal Ontology and Medical Information Science. And so this was 2002, 3, 4, thereabouts. And we've already said that it reflected 2 orthogonal perspectives. So the stock, I referred to it earlier in terms of stocks and flows, but you can also refer to it in terms of products and processes. In medical terms, it would be anatomy versus physiology. And there are all kinds of ways in which this dichotomy manifests itself. So in music, you have a musical score which gets realized in a performance. The musical score is a continuant, it continues to exist through time, and the performance is an occurrence, it occurs at a time. And the background was really very much a commonsensical background. So we weren't interested in physics, we were interested in biology, but not in physics, not in waves versus particles, because clearly there is some analogy between this and the wave-particle dichotomy in quantum mechanics. We weren't interested in those kinds of questions. We were content to have an ontology which would represent the important parts of biology and related phenomena in roughly the way that commonsensical people could understand. And so there are continuants, they continue, they can gain and lose parts, so you are gaining and losing parts all the time, and they keep their identity. And again, there are some philosophers who deny that there are entities which continue in the sense that they preserve their identity. Continuance exists as a whole whenever they exist at all. So if someone chops off my arm, I still exist as a whole after the chopping off of my arm. That is counterintuitive when you first hear it, but it's correct nonetheless. Continuants do not have beginnings, middles, and ends. They have lives which have beginnings, middles, and ends, but lives are occurrence. Lives have temporal parts, such as beginnings, middles, and ends. And then they have phases, and a process unfolds itself in phases. So another word for occurrent pretty much is process. But we also allow occurrence which don't take time. They are process boundaries, such as beginnings and endings. The millennium is a process boundary. And occurrence only exists for a certain time. Occurrence only exists in their phases. So they never exist as a whole. Processes never exist as a whole at any time. They only exist in the corresponding phase which is unfolding at a certain time. So, and you are all a continuant, but your life is a process. And sometimes people talk about 3-dimensional versus 4-dimensional in that context. All right, so that's the top of BFO. And now we have relations. So far we've only had the single relation of is-a. Every independent continuant is a continuant. Now we have dependence. So attributes, at this stage we use the phrase dependent continuant for attribute. So dependent continuants depend on independent continuants, as a quality depends on its bearer. And processes depend upon their participants, as my arm waving depends on my arm. And, for instance, and qualities, dependent continuants depend on their bearers, as, for instance, my temperature depends on me. And there is a participates in relation, so things participate in processes, my arm participates in the waving process. And all of this is specific dependence. So to say that A depends on me, B, for instance, my arm waving depends on my arm, says that my arm waving is necessarily such that if my arm ceases to exist, then it ceases to exist. So it's my arm waving may be qualitatively identical to Werner's arm waving, but that would be a different process. Similarly, my temperature may be qualitatively identical to Werner's temperature, but his temperature is a different temperature because it's his temperature. And we're talking about specific dependence, the dependence of a thing on its specific bearer. And if Werner could have my temperature, that would not be specific dependence. And then we also have dependence on the type level. So this is A depends on B for an instance such as Werner's temperature. Werner's temperature is necessarily such that if Werner ceases to exist, then his temperature ceases to exist. But there is also specific dependence on the type level. Temperature, the type, specifically depends upon organism or material object, let's say, means for every instance of temperature, there is some instance of material being such that that temperature specifically depends on that material being, B. Now, ontology is interested in axioms like this, but they're unpacked in terms of relations on the instance level as expressed here. And this is an important point. So are there any questions about this? Because if you don't get this, then much else will not be intelligible. Yes?
Just to make sure, on the instance level, like we're just talking about particular things,
yes.
And then the difference is just that once we shift to on the type level, we're talking about kinds.
Exactly.
And that's
a bigger difference than you would think.
Mm-hmm.
And I can illustrate the reason why it's a bigger difference very quickly with the following example. See, So you have to correct my anatomy if I get it wrong.
Okay.
So there is the relation of adjacency. On the instance level, every so what is an anatomical structure which is adjacent to the uterus?
To the uterus. The ovaries, yeah.
That's something else.
What do you mean something else?
It's another example.
Cervix.
Yeah?
Cervix. You have a cervix.
No, I'm
No. So it's something that men
women.
have. Something that men have.
Bladder.
Bladder. Every uterine tract is adjacent to some bladder. But not every bladder is adjacent to some uterine tract. So on the kind level, adjacent to is not symmetric. But on the instance level, it's got to be symmetric.
I see.
Now, that is counterintuitive, that adjacency would not be symmetric. Surely if A is adjacent to B, it must be the case that B is adjacent to A. On the kind level, that's not true. And it fails for simultaneity too. And it fails for other important things. So,
Yeah, may I? And it is important, that distinction also for if you write essays. Be extremely careful with the word same. Okay? So be very careful when you say that this table has the same color as this table. So that can only be true if you mean that this color of this table and this color of this table are instances of the very precisely same color type. All right?
and this is important not so much for colour, but for things like headache or disease, where you want to make sure you're not curing the disease kind,
Yeah.
but rather the instances of that.
Or whatever comparison. We have the same temperature. No, that's only in the sense that it's each of our temperatures instantiates exactly the same.
Yeah.
So when you say ontologies are concerned with types and they are unpacked in terms of tokens or instances, is that the approach in general, or is
No,
are
I
there-
would say that the official approach across the ontology domain, or across the world of people who use ontologies, is one according to which ontologies are about types, but then you use the ontologies very often to create what are called knowledge bases. And what that means is you have a lot of information about instances, but you've enhanced the information about instances using ontology terms. And so you have ontologies which are just about types, and then you have knowledge bases which are incorporating instance information as well as ontology information in the strict sense. Those knowledge bases often get called ontologies in a kind of lazy way. So that it's, the terminology is subject to fractal drift.
But are there other ontologies that claim to be top level and don't take universals to be?
I think
The
all
primary.
on top level ontology candidates would say that an ontology is about types. They might, I think so. They might make exceptions for certain very specific instances. For instance, the planet Earth, or the species Homo sapiens, which some people think is an instance, or a top level or high level, upper level ontology of law might have a special place in the United States Constitution, for instance. So there are the privileged individuals are occasionally accepted. The whole of time might be an instance, or the whole universe might be an instance. That might be a privileged instance. But leaving aside those privileged instances, top-level ontologies view ontology in this way, not this way.
But may I add something? Because we have written a couple of papers where we say explicitly that Buffer is about instances, right? And other ontologies as well. So now you are changing your language a little bit. Because an ontology of universals would, for instance, be continuants that have more than 2,000 instances, right? So, like
Yeah.
Dolce has an ontology of, so the main Dolce is ontology about instance, but viewed through those classes, right?
Yes,
But they have an ontology of
so
universals
Ben
as
is
well.
right, and I take back what I said, and I will rephrase it in the way he just said. Ontology is about instances, but viewed through the lens of types, and it's concerned then to cultivate that lens. So that is a lens, or a collection of lenses. The ontology consists of categories, or representations of categories, which are ways of viewing instances. Actually, they are not ways of viewing instances, they are what instances instantiate. And so we're viewing the instances through the kind they instantiate.
I got it finally after the talk of Ingvar Johansson, when he made a comparison. Well, for ontologies, you look through your glasses. Sometimes you want to look at your glasses, and that's exactly the difference
Yeah.
between it.
Yes?
So the arrow from quality to thing, what we're saying with this diagram is, I'm asking for clarity just to make sure, is not that the class quality relates to thing in this way, per se, but rather about all of the instances of quality have at least one thing that they're depending on.
Exactly. And it doesn't sound interesting at this level, but if you get down to a very, very precise level, then it might become interesting.
So just to follow up, when we talk about classes relating to each other, the only way that we talk about them is in terms of like ISA. Is that correct?
No, we can talk. So when we say temperature specifically depends upon material entity, we're relating classes.
Yeah.
So, and this could be added to the graph I showed of all the ISA relations. You can add in all the other relations between those classes, but it would become too tangled. So we don't show those relations, but we could do that. And there are some pictures of ontologies which show more than just ISA relation.
Do you have later a slide where you define the ISA relation for buffer?
No, but I can do that now. A is a B, so big A is a big B, means big A refers to a type and big B refers to a type, and every instance of A is an instance of B.
Right. And that's important because for most ontologies it's exactly the opposite. So they start with big A is a B, and then they say as a consequence, if this is an instance of A, it is an instance of B. So for Buffo, it's exactly the way around. Okay, we define the ISA relationship on the basis of the instances.
And I would say that it's not quite as bad as you suggest, because OWL has that built into it, that particular definition. It's just that OWL doesn't understand about kinds.
Yeah.
Yes?
I'm just a little confused on the spatial volume shows up under continuance, and spatial temporal
Yeah.
volume straddles
Yeah.
category.
No, spatiotemporal is under recurrent, so nothing straddles. Everything is either an occurrent or a continuum. So spatiotemporal is an occurrent because it's extended in time. And extended in time in the way that it's built out of its successive phases, where spatial is a continuum because it continues to exist through time. So the spatial region occupied by the universe doesn't move because there's nowhere for it to go. Maybe it expands, but certainly it is continuing to exist, one and the same region, according to this view. Many philosophers and many philosophically inspired ontologists, one of them is called John Sower, and we'll meet him again in a minute, think that there are straddles, or that there is no real division between continuance and occurrence. And his favorite examples are things like forest fires or waves, or people indeed, because people are changing all the time, therefore they must be occurrence. And he gets angry very easily if you dispute with him, but we'll come back to him later on. Okay, so there are three types of specifically dependent continuous recognized by BFO. That doesn't mean that there won't be more, because at the moment we've recognized these three, but somebody may say, look, there is this fourth type, and you need to recognize it too, otherwise you can't deal with those data. So BFO wants to be complete with regard to data collected in empirical science or in empirical activities of other kinds. But at the moment we just have these three: qualities, roles, and dispositions. And quality is something like red. Roles and dispositions are what we call realizables. Roles are social realizables, roughly speaking, which means that they are realizables which things have because they are assigned a certain attribute socially or through a decision. So not everybody eats monkey's brains. But in some countries, monkey's brains are a food. So they have the food role. But in other countries, monkey's brains are not a food. So they don't have the food role. Dispositions are realizables. By realizable, I mean they can be realized in process. Dispositions are realizables, which are realized because of the way they are built physically. So the glass has the disposition to break because of its physics. And then functions are special kinds of dispositions. And we'll come back to functions in a little while. So we have non-realizable dependent continuants, which are quality, and we have realizable dependent continuants, which are roles and dispositions, and then functions are a special kind of disposition. And each of these have instances. So the function of my heart to pump blood is an instance of the kind function to pump. And the realization process depends upon the realizable continuum. So I have a disposition to wave my hand when lecturing. That is a disposition which is realized in hand waving processes. And then we can say that roles are externally grounded. They exist because the bearer is in some special social or institutional circumstances. Maybe also physical, that's the question. So is being first in a queue a physical phenomenon or a social phenomenon? That's a question which has no clear answer. But the point is that roles are optional. That is to say, a role can cease to exist without any physical change. So you can lose your job without changing at all. You can't lose your disposition to go bald without your physics being changed. And there are lots of people who want to win the Nobel Prize for finding a way of doing that. And we define roles then. To say that John is an instance of nurse means that John is a human being, and at a certain time, for a certain period of time, there is an instance of the nurse role which inheres in John. And the same goes for lecturer, lawyer, student, professor, and so on. So employee, employer, chairman, president, they all can be defined in terms of this template. And disposition, I said, is grounded in the physics or the internal makeup of an entity. So disposition is where we put anything relating to what might be. Powers, tendencies, possibilities, they all go under the heading of disposition. And we can try and work out how to deal with cause in terms of disposition. So often, at least, when we say that the P causes Q, what we mean is that P has a disposition, that P triggers a disposition in some entity to do Q. So this is not intended as a theory of causality. BFO doesn't have a theory of causality yet, but this would be the kernel of a BFO theory of causality. All right, now functions are good dispositions. They're the ones that entities were designed to have, either by God through evolutionary processes or by some engineer through design of an artifact. So screwdrivers have functions, organs in organisms have functions. Screwdrivers have those functions because the screwdriver exists because somebody wanted something which could do this thing. So it existed to have the disposition to screw screws. The heart exists because one of our remote ancestors or a sequence of our remote ancestors needed something like blood circulation, and so the precursors began to have precursor blood circulation systems in their bodies, and they evolved and evolved and evolved until some of those processes turned into processes in which what are recognizably called hearts were involved. So the heart has the function to pump because that is the reason, evolutionarily speaking, for this organ to exist. That's what BFO says. All right, so functions are continuants. So my heart has the disposition to pump at every point at which it exists. It's functioning all the time by realizing this function in pumping blood. All right, this is how we've got so far. Functionings are occurrence, functions are dispositions, which are realizable continuants, which are dependent continuants, and which are continuants. Diseases are bad dispositions, and they are realized through malfunctionings of one sort or another, we might say. That's not part of BFO, that's just a hand-waving exercise in the direction of a disease ontology, which we will learn about later. BFO also has the term site. Site is another word for place or aperture or hole with an H. There are these things in the world, and we have data about them, we can perceive them, we live in them. We would be dead without them. This is an example of a site. This is Manhattan Canyon. And now we notice that Manhattan is ambiguous. It can mean either a material entity or a complex of sites. And we couldn't live in Manhattan if there were no sites. But people, of course, don't always use the word Manhattan clearly. Some people say they live in Manhattan, but they certainly don't live in a collection of bricks and rocks and other sorts. What they usually mean is a sum of both of those two. And this ambiguity applies to all of the things in which sites occur. So you say you're getting into bed, but you're actually creating a site by climbing between the sheets, and then you're occupying that site which you create. Just as a fish which is swimming creates the hole in the water which it inhabits, and that hole moves around as the fish moves. All right. Now, we need sites in addition to three-dimensional spatial regions because sites can move, as we just saw with the bedsheet, for example, or the fishes. All right, that's the end of BFO 1.1. BFO 1.0. BFO 1.1 starts out from here, and it introduces a new kind of dependence, which is generic dependence, which turns on the fact that some attributes are copyable, some patterns are copyable. So I can take a file on my computer and I can copy it to another computer. The file is a pattern. It can only exist in some kind of memory bearer, memory store, something like a computer. The same applies to a DNA sequence. You can't have DNA sequences without there being some kind of material which they are the pattern of. The point is that these kinds of patterns can be copied. They can exist in many copies, indefinitely many copies. So they're not dependent in the specific sense on their bearers. They are dependent in a generic sense. They have to have some bearer, but they can have many bearers, and they can transfer, they can migrate from one bearer to another. All right, so information objects are all over the place. Software, and so forth. Plans and laws, and they can be concretized in specifically dependent continuums. So if I write a plan on a piece of paper using ink, then I concretize what might have been the plan in my head. I concretize it as a pattern of ink, little piles of ink on a piece of paper. So we have a relation of concretizing between a generically dependent and a specifically dependent. And Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is a continuant, it's not an occurrent. It's a generically dependent continuant which is concretized in scores which are instructions for creating performances. Not many people know that, but that's what Beethoven's Ninth Symphony is. It's a generically dependent continuant pattern, concretized in scores, or in corresponding structures in the heads of people who know the score. So if some people like that survive, if all the scores are destroyed, the symphony would still exist. All right, so generically dependent continuants can be concretized in different media, sometimes in neurological media. Concretizations are specifically dependent continuous. They're instances. And this particular score is the bearer of a pattern of ink mark, which concretizes the generically dependent continuum, which is the symphony. All right, and when you fill out a medical record, you create a concretization of the record, which can then be digitalized and copied to different servers. And your concretization is one concretization in the medium of ink, and the other concretizations are in the medium of pixels or electromagnetic excitations in hard drive. All right, so the same datum can exist in many concretizations, potentially also in many formats. That's an area where we have not really got a mature body of work yet, but it's outside BFO and it's in the information artifact. So this is where we are now. So we have two main kinds of generically dependent continuants: information artifacts and nucleotide sequences. And there may be others, trademarks, chessboard patterns, but these are the two main ones. So these are all examples of information artifacts. These are other examples of information artifacts. And now what happened was this. We had the oboe foundry, we had the protein ontology, the cell ontology, and so forth. We were building these ontologies, and we were using the ontologies to tag data deriving from experiments. And it was really useful. The people doing the experiments really liked the idea, because experimental biology at that stage too was plagued by the pestilence of local coding habits. So you couldn't share data. They had never had the French Revolution, which introduced meters and kilograms and seconds. So there might be 30 different ways of referring to the same molecule in different communities. So they had the ontologies and they liked that. Then they wanted to use the ontologies to describe their experiments. And now the experiments you describe not just by using words like cell or protein, but also by using words like parameter or equipment or setting or funding agency or publication or footnote. So they created OBI, the Ontology for Biomedical Investigations. So one of my many small claims to fame is that I named OBI. Originally it was called the Functional Genomics Investigation Ontology. The reason it was called that is because they thought FUGO was a nice acronym. Of course, it wouldn't be FUGO, it would be FUGIO. But I said, so I was a member of the board of advisors of the Functional Genomics Investigation Ontology. I said, all of these terms would apply to every biological, biomedical experiment. So it shouldn't be called Functional Genomics Investigation Ontology, it should be called the Ontology for Biomedical Investigations. And they all had a eureka moment. And OBI was born. Now, but then we had another eureka moment, because Alan Ruttenberg and Alan you will meet perhaps in the course of this semester. He is an ontologist par excellence in the dental school. He pointed out that many of the terms would apply to many other things completely remote from biomedical investigation. Terms like footnote or publication have nothing to do with biology or experiment at all. They're much more generic. And so we created the information artifact ontology, which includes images, software, algorithms, documents, laws, many other things. And then the idea is that the connection between those ontologies on the right and these ontologies on the left is the relation of aboutness. So an information artifact is always about something. And some of you in the room are interested in the military things, so we created also an ontology called IAO Intel, which is about intelligence, community, information artifacts. And then we came to BOFO 2.0, which is 2014. It's 4 years old, and we even have a specification with instructions and explanations and footnotes and so forth, which we didn't have for 1.1 or 1.0. We had the OWL file, and we had various documents, but we didn't have a specification. So this specification was created, and I would say the biggest change otherwise between 2.0 and 1.1 was that we worked very hard to future-proof BFO against eventual uses of BFO by physicists. So remember, I said that the earlier versions were addressed to common sense and to the worldview of biologists rather than to the worldview of physicists. In BFO 2.0, we tried to make it more neutral as between physics and common sense. And the one principal way in which this manifests itself is that we have a clearer understanding of spatial boundaries. So if you think about the boundary of an organism, so from a common sense point of view, there is a continuous envelope, a membrane or something like that. But there is a continuous envelope on the external facing side of that membrane, which is a physical boundary, we think, so that you can poke it with a scalpel and perform surgery because there is this physical boundary which is penetrable. But in fact, if you look at this outer surface of the membrane very closely using a microscope, you will find that there is no such determinate line or surface which separates the interior from the exterior. Rather, the closer you look, the more you just see molecules with gaps between them, or particles with gaps between them. And so, but there is a sense in which there is a boundary there. If you look at an atlas of surgical anatomy, you'll see all the boundaries where you can penetrate with a scalpel. And so we said there are these boundaries, but they are not physical boundaries, they're what we call fiat boundaries. That is to say, they are boundaries of the sort which arise as a result of human demarcation. So the best examples of fiat boundaries are in geopolitics, the boundary between Colorado and Utah, which I'm assuming is a straight line. I'm hoping that they are adjacent.
Yes.
They are.
They are adjacent.
Good.
And it's
So
mostly straight.
Okay, there is a part which is straight. That's a very good example of a fiat boundary. There's nothing physical there.
Yeah, and the parts that aren't straight are because of errors when they went out and...
Errors?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, when they went out and, what is it? Not scouted it, but, you know, drew the line. They made errors, and so in attempting to make it straight, they had nothing to do with the topology or anything.
Well, that's interesting. I didn't know about that. Yes?
So, all boundaries in BFO 2.0 are fiat boundaries.
Yes.
Is this problematic at all? Because if we want to create a realist ontology, now we're going to say, okay, well, we're going to make all the boundaries that we have just boundaries that we want to kind of demarcate? Because don't you want like an actual boundary that you're talking about?
No. So first of all, BFO doesn't have anything negative, so we don't deny that there are physical boundaries. There are no negative claims. There are no completeness claims.
Okay.
We don't say that there are only fiat boundaries. We just say in BFO2, the only boundaries, the only spatial boundaries that we recognize are fiat boundaries. And now, there's more to be said. So, for instance, it may be, and BFO would be perfectly comfortable with this, it may be that there was a point at which the universe began to exist, a point in time. So it may be that there are non-fiat temporal boundaries. There certainly are physical boundaries in the non-fiat sense, but we don't, so how am I going to express this? So we don't want to deny that there are physical discontinuities. We just want to deny that they are continuous surfaces.
Okay.
And that's a long story, but in any case, my first answer is all you need. We don't deny that they exist, because we don't deny the existence of anything.
Okay.
All right. Now, the next part is about other candidates, and there are 3 candidates I'm going to talk about seriously.
Just one tricky question. So, so what is basic form of the BFO? What is that then exactly? Knowing that BFO 1.0 exists, because the last documents are 1.1 exists and 2.0.
They're all continuing information artifacts.
Independent of each other. Right?
Yes.
Yes. And what is BFO then?
That is documented in the ISO standard so I found a way around that problem. There is only one thing called BFO, but it has so far 3 versions. It will very soon have a 4th version, which we call BFO ISO. And we'll come to that in a minute. All right, so there are 3 candidate upper ontologies that we can take seriously. There is a 4th one called Scythe, which we also have to take seriously, but we'll see that it's not necessarily to be taken seriously as a candidate upper ontology. So they're all in the public domain. They're all available on the web. You can find papers about them. They have users. BFO is small. It's strictly domain neutral. So it contains terms like object, role, function, which can be applied at least to many, many domains. Dolce, it grew out of the same school of thought as BFO. So I was there at the beginning of Dolce, and I was working with the Dolce people. But then I moved and created BFO, not necessarily as an antidote to Dolce, just as something separate.
So where was that then?
So I was working with the Dolce people in, I believe, 1996. And I can summarize it, that they were creating documentation which was not clear enough for my purposes. And I tried to work with them to make it clearer, but the attempt to collaborate on that level did not work out. But the big difference between BFO and Dolce is that, or one big difference anyway, we'll come to another one in a minute, that BFO is strictly boring, and it's just an object. That's not interesting. There are no cancers of object, just as there are no cancers of anatomical structure. But Dolce wants to have interesting terms like society and achievement and accomplishment, and that's for complicated reasons having to do with the fact that they were influenced by linguists. Sumo makes that mistake much more, so it has a little biology and a little physics and a little bit of sociology, and it's much, much bigger as a consequence than BFO and Dolce. But the problem is that the terms it has for biology are not terms that biologists would ever accept. So they have a term body covering, and then another term fruit or vegetable. They have the term monkey in Sumo. Again, it's not a word that biologists would use.
No, I hear it often.
For that reason, Sumo is not really a top-level ontology. It's a top-level ontology with all kinds of non-top level admixtures. And remember, for modularity to work, the top level has to be a module, it has to be a piece unto itself. If it has other stuff, you can see how conflicts will arise. So you could never persuade a biologist to use sumo as a top level ontology, or a chemist, or a physicist. All right, now psych has 3,000 terms. Upper psych. Psych itself is gigantic. It's an attempt to create an encyclopedia in a roughly ontological form of the entirety of human common sense. And it's been very successful in that respect, in the sense that it was used by Google, it was used by the CIA, it was used by other people, sometimes not successfully, sometimes successfully. Upper psych is a small part of this big thing called psych. Some people say it's the largest artificial intelligence project in the world. So I will talk a little bit more about psych in a minute, but let's say some more things about Dolce and Sumo. So, like BFO, Dolce is a true upper level, really, because the society things are not really important elements. You can find some history of how close they are together and how they were born in this paper by Nicola Guarino, who was the primary begetter. He begat Dolce. Dolce means the domain ontology for linguistic and cognitive engineering. So Dolce, like BFO, has this basic distinction between continuous and occurrence. It has also the basic distinction between independent entities and dependent entities. It also has just these two levels of instance, which are behind the spectacles, and universals, which are what you see when you look at Dolce. Buffo has many more users, many more users, and many long-standing users. So Dolce tends to be used by people who have European Union research grants. It has much more thorough documentation and more rigorous documentation, I believe. It has a much more active and broad user community, so there are clever people who use Dolce, but they tend to be isolated. So that there's one person in Ottawa that I know of who does really good work with Dolce, but he's isolated, where BFO has communities of people. And it's not true that all users of Dolce are based in Italy. Both of them draw on the ontological square. But now the big difference, apart from this small admixture of social terms, is that BFO is about cognition, it's not really about reality. They don't want to have deep metaphysical implications, they say. So everything is fiat. Everything is a matter of how humans slice up the world. All the universals depend, as they say, on human perception, cultural imprints, and social conventions. BFO would say, we recognize the universals that we recognize because in order to inhabit this world, we need to have these social conventions and cultural imprints, because we see that giraffes are different from rucksacks. Because giraffes are different from rucksacks in a number of different ways. So rucksacks have more legs. I'm sorry, it's the other way around. So, if Dolce says that universals such as perception are dependent on human perception, but that can't be right. If something is dependent on human perception, there has to be such a thing as human perception, and then human perception has to be a realm where there are universals. Either you see it or you don't see it. Either your eyes are closed or your eyes are open, and these are universals. All perception is manifesting distinctions like that. They can't be dependent on perception too, because otherwise you end up with the usual philosophical mistake of an infinite regress. And now sumo. Sumo is also based on the distinction between continuous and occurrence. They get that right. And it does incorporate elements taken over from BFO. So sumo means suggested upper merged ontology. And they merge several portions of ontologies. one of which was written by me, so there is part of Summa which I wrote, in effect. First of all, it's not a true formal ontology, we've already said that, but the most important problem with Summa is that it doesn't recognize dependent continuance. So you remember this, the Frege ontology. This Summa is based on predicate logic. They don't have any room for headaches or magnetic fields or shapes or lumps or holes, or they only have things, oxen, organs, so they have a lot of mathematical entities, but they don't, when it comes to the world of what happens and is the case, they only have things and attributes. And I've talked to the primary author, maintainer of Sumo, and I say, where do headaches go? All you can say is that the predicate headache holds of John. But you can't say that John had a headache which started at 2 p.m. and ended at 3 p.m. because there is no headache in the Sumo ontology. He didn't understand my problem. So he sees the world so consistently through the Fregean spectacles that he can't see what is missing. And so I think that this makes Sumo unusable for all the ontology applications that we have, where people are referring to instances which are not things, whether they're temperatures or shapes or patterns, even instances of information artifacts. But he can deal with books, but he can't deal with PDF files, at least not according to his official ontology. All right, now, Psych, like Dolce and like Buffo 1.0, is rooted in common sense. The goal of Psych was to create a gigantic ontology of common sense. But now common sense is not consistent. Psych embraces that. He says, okay, well then our ontology won't be consistent. We'll have many inconsistent micro-theories. This will do justice to common sense. If we made common sense as represented in Psych consistent, it wouldn't be a good representation of common sense. Now, if you're interested in ontology for scientific purposes of cross-domain integration, which is what we're interested in, then Psych is useless because it's not consistent. Or anyway, it's very difficult to use. And so it's part of common sense that there is something called the immaculate conception. And they have a definition of the immaculate conception, because it is part of common sense. It's the conceiving something biological reproduction event in which Mary, mother of Jesus, was conceived. That's the definition. Catholic dogma holds that Mary, unlike Jesus, was conceived by conventional biological means, but that God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob interceded at the time of her conception to keep her free from the stain of original sin. That's what it says, immaculate. That's part of Psych. Now, I have been working for some time to try and get BFO adopted as an ISO standard. We are reaching what I hope will be the home stretch. And someone who has been trying to argue against this initiative is a philosopher called John Sower, who is one of the adherents of the Psych approach. So common sense is inconsistent, that's fine, we just have inconsistent representation. So we shouldn't seek consistency, we should develop instead a structure of micro-theories to accommodate an open-ended, possibly inconsistent knowledge soup, rich enough to include any possible language game that any finite reasoner could ever invent, he says. Now, this knowledge soup idea, he uses this idea to combat anybody who tries to put forward a logically rigorous ontology, upper level ontology, except his own. So he has this top level ontology, a hierarchy of top-level categories, which it looks very nice, but then the bottom has things like object, process, well that's fine, schema, script, juncture, participation, description, history, structure, situation, reason, and purpose. And all of these are occurrence. But they're also, all of them are continuous. But that's fine, because we're not aiming for consistency or anything. Now, I'm going to have some... he and I had a debate, so we've been debating for years. When we meet, we are friendly, but then he writes nasty things about how I've destroyed the future of ontology for all eternity, partly because I'm English. But anyway, he's gradually maturing. So he's now working on a new ontology which is called PWWWB, or PWQB, which rests upon Peirce, who is an American and therefore good, and Bertalanffy, who is neither an American nor English, therefore neutral, and Whitehead, Wittgenstein, and Wilkins. So I'm citing something now which doesn't give credit to Wilkins, but this is Wilkins, Whitehead, and Wittgenstein. Wilkins was I think 17th century English creator of a gigantic ontology-like artifact. So he's now working with this PWQB ontology, which I guess is going to look very similar to that. And we debated it, and you can find the long debate. It's 2.5 hours long. It's really fun at this link. But I extracted just 49 seconds. I'll explain the reason for this 49 seconds. So he claims that PWQB is obviously the best ontology ever. And he also points out in the same paragraph, as it were, of this debate, that he invented it only the day before. But he also claims that BFO is a sub-ontology of PWQB. So he could just show how, of course, BFO is fine, but it's just a sub-ontology of PWQB. So this is the 49 seconds. I hope that.
So if you want to say that a given ontology, say the Peirce-Wilkins cubed ontology, is higher up the tree than another ontology, say BFO, then you have to provide a true path connecting the lower to the higher. John doesn't tend to do that detailed work.
I will do that.
He loses his temper instead. And so that's the difference. That's the difference.
I will do that.
Okay, I will come back in 5 years and see if you did it.
I'll do that tomorrow.
All right, I think we've addressed that, and we've run out of time.
That was the end of the debate. It's now 5 months. I'm going to come back in 5 years. All right, so we can compare. So I didn't mention these other ontologies. I guess I will mention them. So research psych, I did mention. That's just a slightly different version of upper psych. ISO 15926 is the it's an international standard for treating data information and information in the oil and gas industry. And it was put forward by one of its chief architects as a top-level ontology which could be used for any domain that you like, not just oil and gas. Highfleet was the name of a company, an ontology company, and I knew the founders, the owners of Highfleet very well. They're good ontologists. They created an upper-level ontology for their customers. Unfortunately, they then went bankrupt, and it was a proprietary ontology, and so you can't see it, and the company is bankrupt. So it's probably not a good candidate for general use.
Who were they?
Bill Anderson.
Oh, okay.
And OntoStep is an ontology counterpart of it's an ontology counterpart of an engineering standard called STEP. Now, OntoStep is small, so it's quite small, so it gets some credit for that, but it's not open and it's not top level. Highfleet is small and it's top level, but it's not open. ISO 15926 is huge, it's not open, and it's not top level. although its makers claim that it is common. So it doesn't get points for any of those things, although they are working on a new version which will be more clearly a candidate top-level ontology. So they do good work in some way. Research site we've already discussed. Sumo we've already discussed. Both Buffo and Dolce get full marks on all of those three categories. Now, unfortunately, Dolce fails when it comes to documentation, because it doesn't really have user documentation. Sumo, on the other hand, really does have good documentation, both for users and technical documentation. And so BFO has been very active in cultivating user communities. We think that ontologies are valuable only if they have users. This was the motto of the gene ontology. So the gene ontology realized that an ontology is useless, and so it's been used aggressively. So that's a chicken and egg problem. Dolce doesn't have very many users, unfortunately. But it does have some good individuals who use it very well in very interesting ways. Sumo, I don't know. There are some people who use Sumo. Maybe it's unfair to give it no marks for that. But there's no real support for users in the sense that there is a web page which is really a very good and useful web page, but I don't know of any Sumo outreach. I don't know of meetings of Sumo users. I don't know of any user forum. I don't know of any of the things that you need in order to cultivate communities of users in the sense that we are practicing in BFO. And then axiomatization. Well, both BFO and Dolce have axiomatizations in both OWL and common logic. Did I talk about common logic 2 weeks ago?
You mentioned it.
It's first order logic, but enhanced for computing purposes. No other ontology has both of those things. BFO has a consistency proof for the common logic axiomatization. They have natural language definitions. Both of them have natural language definitions for all their terms. So BFO, I would claim, is stable over 12 years, 12 to 15 years. It's had 3 versions so far, and it's about to have a 4th version. There have been multiple different kinds of versions of Dolce, to a degree which has caused confusion. BFO has an explicit license, which is not true of Dolce. So the only upper ontology candidate which gets full marks is BFO. Now, I would say that because I am an adherent to BFO, but still, I think I can back up my assertion that it's the only ontology candidate which addresses all of these features. Yes?
By explicit license, do you mean like Creative Commons or something else? Okay.
Creative Commons. All right, so, and we have the book, and now we're moving towards becoming an international standard. So the International Standards Organization and the International Electrotechnical Commission are engaged in standardizing things like power components, so plugs. And they define connectors of all kinds, and BFO is a connector. And so they formed a committee called Joint Technical Committee JTC1 for standardization in the field of information technology. And they have different working groups. So they have the Joint Technical Committee has a subcommittee for data interchange, which has a working group number 2 for metadata standards. And this is where we are. So this subcommittee has been considering for a year and a half now BFO as an ISO standard. And I don't think I need to go through this, but there are 6 national bodies involved. The US, the UK, Canada, Korea, Japan, and Italy. And so this is, the motto of ISO is when the world agrees, which I think is not the best motto. So it will be ISO IEC standard 21838. This standard will be a multi-part standard. Part 1 is a standard which states the requirements for being a top-level ontology. And it's in this connection that we define what an ontology is. So there are 8 definitions of 8 definitions of ontology in ISO, which are quite interesting. Number D is organization of concepts for which a rational argument can be made.
You don't have to do it.
Explicit and conceptual specification of concepts of an application domain independent of any use of these concepts. This is just ontology. Rigorous conceptual schema representing the subject domain. A lexicon of specialized terminology along with some specification of the meaning of terms in the lexicon. Model that represents the domain and is used to reason about the objects in that domain. So these are all definitions which if you read them sympathetically, then they sort of work. The best one, well, no, I don't think any of them is best. So this one may be a logical structure of the terms used to describe a domain of knowledge. But what is a logical structure? That's too vague for our purposes. So we have the following. An ontology is a collection. Now you have to remember, every word matters. A collection is something like a stamp collection. But the very same collection can have 100 stamps in 1 year and 1,000 stamps 10 years later. It's still the same collection. It's a collection of terms, which are nouns and noun phrases, relational expressions, which are is-of, or part of, and associated natural language definitions, which we'll be talking about, together with one or more formal theories designed to capture the intended interpretations of these definitions. And then we define a domain as a collection of entities of interest. I couldn't get rid of that of interest. It's a typical ISO expression. Entities of interest to a certain community or discipline, and a domain ontology is an ontology whose terms represent classes or types in some domain. And then we define a category as a general class or type shared across many domains. And we define a top-level ontology as an ontology created to represent the categories that are shared across a maximally broad range of domains.
So did you define class too, or?
That comes from OWL, from the W3C. Type is OWL word. All right. So now the problem is, how do we test? So an ISO standard has to have a conformance criteria. You have to be able to test whether something satisfies the standard. How do we test that an ontology is representing the categories shared across a maximally broad range of domains? Anyone have any idea? Any proposal? How do you test that? We found a way.
No, I think I suggested part of it, right? I think I suggested part of it.
Maybe.
Could you repeat the question?
How do we test whether something satisfies this definition? So I could say, I created this ontology to represent a maximally broad range of domains. How would you test whether I was right? Anyway, what we did, actually no, I'll explain how we test it. I'll say one or two more preliminary things first. So first of all, it should cover everything that exists. It should have 3 parts. The textual part, which is the definitions I mentioned already, an OWL axiomatization and common logic axiomatization. That if you want to be a top-level ontology which satisfies this standard, you have to have those 3 things. And it's the shall cover all entities that is the way we test it. So we provide, I think, 15 test questions, or collections of test questions, covering these 15 different areas. And for each of these areas, you have to show how your ontology deals with data, which are collected along one or other of the corresponding dimensions. So you have to be able to deal with space, but you also have to be able to deal with place. You have to be able to deal with both scale and granularity. You have to be able to deal with both quantities and mathematical entities. You have to be able to deal with information and reference. You have to be able to deal with artifacts and social, and so on. So you just have to show how your ontology will deal with each of these items. And now one way of answering the question is to say, we don't deal with information artifacts because we built the extension ontology called the information artifact ontology. So that would be an acceptable answer. And as long as it's an extension ontology rather than a supplement. And one of John Sower's arguments repeatedly in all of these debates was BFO can't be a top-level ontology because it has no way of dealing with information. But we have the whole version 1.1 transformation, which was brought about in order to be able to deal with information in a BFO conformant way. Okay. So I won't go through the remaining clauses. So one of the reasons why common logic is important is because it is itself an isostandards.
Can we nevertheless go back to the previous point? If you just create an ontology which has one class and its entity,
Yep.
so then it can deal with all the...
No, it's not.
Why not?
Show me how. You have to give an account of how you deal with it.
Well, Buffo, for instance, did it. That would be the proof.
But by saying that, unless you do the same thing, you're only saying that there is a way of doing it. You're not showing how you did it. You're saying that there is a way of doing it. You have to describe, not just give answers, but describe how your ontology conforms to those answers. And one way of doing that is not to say, well, BFO did it.
Okay.
It would be an interesting question whether you could define an ontology which has entity and nothing else.
Yeah.
But then you say, well, we know that BFO descends from entity. But you're not answering this. You're not giving... We give illustrations of the kind of answers which would be appropriate. All right, so any more questions about that? Nope. So I'm going to go through some more detail.
Yeah, one more. Is it truly a free, because usually you pay for each ISO standard.
It is freely available, and the BFO standard will also be freely available. And the reason is that if something is made, which already exists, is made into an ISO standard, then the ISO standard will also be included.
Okay.
And we are reassured that it will be. All right, so I talked about the relationship between fiat boundaries and physics earlier on, but I want to say more about fiat boundaries and space. So BFO has 4 different kinds of spatial regions: 0, 1, 2, and 3-dimensional spatial regions. So these are spatial volumes, these are spatial areas, these are spatial lines, and these are spatial points. And correspondingly, we have 0, 1, and 2-dimensional fiat boundaries. So a 0-dimensional fiat boundary would be the North Pole, which is not a pole. It's a dot. And on a map, even, it's what the dot on the map represents, which is a 0-dimensional fiat boundary at the top of the planet. And a 1-dimensional continuant fiat boundary would be the equator. A 2-dimensional continuant fiat boundary would be the surface of Utah. Utah doesn't have a straight boundary exactly, but it will do.
Yeah.
Any quadrant created by lines of latitude and longitude would be a 2-dimensional continuum. It's a continuant fiat boundary of the planet. It's a surface, part of the surface of the planet. Now, they are located in corresponding spatial regions, but which spatial regions they're located in varies from one time to the next, because the planet is rotating. And now what about three-dimensional spatial regions? What is located in three-dimensional spatial regions? Well, first of all, sites are located in three-dimensional regions. But then also the planet, or organisms, or tables, or chairs, or buildings, or clocks. All material entities are located in three-dimensional spatial regions. All the holes, the apertures, orifices, and so forth, are in three-dimensional spatial regions. And all the gaps, all of the rest of the universe, where the objects are not, is located in a very big three-dimensional spatial region. Yes?
Could you not have a hole in a two-dimensional spatial region?
It's not a site in BFO terms, because sites are always three-dimensional. But you're right, that's a good point. I must write that down. Can you lend me a pen and a piece of paper?
Me a pen? I'm digital.
I think I used to find a paper somewhere. No, that doesn't work.
I got a pencil. Yes, you do.
All right, so to answer your question, a hole in a two-dimensional surface would be a two-dimensional continuum fiat boundary.
Okay.
There must always be something there. So if you imagine a country with another country inside it, let's suppose both of them are rectangles, then the first country has a hole in it. But that hole is still there. And I can't think of a way in which it could not be still there, but who knows? So a donut doesn't have any hole in the two-dimensional surface. It only has a hole when you take the three-dimensional. But it's an interesting question on this. All right, so material entities and sites can both occupy three-dimensional spatial regions. Now, similarly, just as continuum fiat boundaries in spatial dimensions are located in spatial regions, so process boundaries are located in temporal regions. So processes are located in one-dimensional temporal regions because they take time, and process boundaries are located in zero-dimensional temporal regions. And then there are two kinds of independent continuums according to BFO. There are material entities on the one hand and immaterial entities on the other hand. So immaterial entities are easier. They are sites, continuum fiat boundaries, so surfaces, and spatial regions. And they're independent, immaterial means they contain no molecules as parts, or no physical particles as parts. And then independent continuums on the material side include objects, fiat object parts, and object aggregates. And objects are of three sorts. So there are three sorts of natural units which are currently catalogued by BFO. So it may be that we will extend the realm of objects to include other kinds of natural units. But the three kinds that we acknowledge at this stage are organisms and cells, organs and so forth, so organic natural units, portions of solid matter, so a lump of rock, or an ice cube, I guess, And then engineered artifacts such as a watch or a laptop or a pencil. And the idea is that we define for each of these natural units a certain kind of causal connection, and then the unit is a unit because the causal connection relation, it relates directly or indirectly every part of the entity in question, but doesn't relate to any outside entity. So the relation in question might be material adjacency or connectedness. And if you take a laptop, then the laptop is every part of the laptop is connected directly or indirectly to something inside the laptop, but it's not connected to anything outside the laptop. It's not if you take the plug out. And so fiat object part, this is connected with the Buffo theory of fiat boundaries. So if you take an object such as me, then I have an arm, and the arm is certainly part of me, but it's not a part of me in the way in which my blood cells are part of me, for instance. I can't remove the arm without doing damage. So the arm is connected to me in a very strong sense. But there is a boundary between my arm and the rest of me, but it's a fiat boundary. It's not a physical boundary. So the arm is a fiat part, a fiat object part. And if we take me and Werner, then we constitute not an object, but an object aggregate, because we have two objects which form the parts of one and the same entity. And so this is a picture of fiat objects in the realm of, I believe, Austrian butchery. So we have the Hüferschanzel and the Riedhüfel and the Bayreuth and so on. All of these are parts which are fiat object parts until you actually butcher the cow, and then you create objects, because a steak is an object. And then this is an object aggregate. So it's not a sum, it's something more like a set. So the reason why it's not a sum is because a sum has many parts. So the core of each of these apples is part of the sum which they together constitute. The core is not one of the objects in the object aggregate. An object aggregate has its parts, only the objects, not the parts of the object. So there are only three parts to this object aggregate, namely the three apples. And another way of putting that is to say that the John Lennon's nose was not one of the Beatles, even though John Lennon's nose was a part of the sum of the Beatles. I don't know why I always talk about the Beatles when I get to this point, but another term which we added in our 2.0 revisions was the term history. History is the sum of all the processes which take place in the course of the life of an entity, any entity, which means all the processes within that spatial region that the entity occupied as it lived its life.
But then you could make the same argument for some, right?
Namely?
Well, the process which is that part of my life sitting here is not my history.
No, it's a part of your history.
Yeah.
And so is the process of your arms being folded.
Yes,
now,
right.
that's a part of it.
So
we want, and all the neutrinos going through your body now are part of it. All the processes of neutrinos passing through your body are part of your history.
And the old aggregate of processes was not needed specifically because of that reason.
We don't need aggregates of processes for this. We may need them for other things like football matches or something. They are social. I think you need aggregates of processes in the social life, not the physical. Yes?
So at the beginning of the lecture you said that I am a continuant, but my life is a process.
Yeah.
So the history applies to me and not my life process? Or my life
The
process would be a part of
is
the
your.
history.
So we don't want it to say life process because the neutrinos passing through you have nothing to do with your life.
Okay.
But it's the sum of all the processes which occur within the spatiotemporal worm, which is created by the fact that you are existing for a certain period and moving about and so forth.
So my
all the
life.
breathings, all the speakings, but only to the point where your mouth, the air vibrations
Mhm.
stop at your mouth, as it were.
So my life would be a part of my history.
If we talk about just the biological processes which you're involved in and call that your life, then your life would be part of it.
Okay.
And if we're talking about processes involving other people, then it's only your part in those processes which count as part of your history.
Okay.
So this conversation that we're now having, you would get ear vibrations for my contributions and sound vibrations and mouth excitations for your part of the contribution.
Okay.
All right, and so we'll be talking in a later lecture about organs, which is the Ontology for General Medical Science, which is an ontology for understanding those things, attributes and processes involved in a typical medical encounter. And there you talk about the life. But now we say of an extended organism. And what we mean by that is so there are all kinds of bacteria in your ears, for instance, in your ear orifices. They form part of your extended organism. They're biologically very important. And they're in the extended organism in the sense that we go as far as the outer fiat boundaries of your bodily orifices. So that's what that means there. And that means that the history which is relevant is the history of the object aggregate, which includes not only you, but all of those other entities which are in the interior of your body, including all the bacteria. So we make a solid object out of an organism, when in fact an organism contains lots of holes where all the bacteria are. So we've had this, we don't need this anymore.
So would that apply then to the whole of the donut too?
Yeah, but there's no need to have the extended donut. There's no scientific need.
I agree with the scientific.
It might apply to, there may be entities where it does apply. So I guess if you want the life of a car, you're going to want to have all that transpires within the exhaust pipe. That might be an analogy. So just as there is an extended organism for medical reasons, so there is an extended car for automobile repair reasons.
I was just thinking of Willem Tell. Imagine that there would not have been an apple on his son's head, but a donut. And the task was to shoot through the whole of the donut.
You'd have to get the donut to balance on the
Yes.
head. Getting the apple to balance is already quite hard, I would think, under those conditions. So it's probably a fiction.
But they are not sticky. So,
All right. So we have just a few more minutes, and I think so. Because we didn't have a break, I'm going to finish at 3:30. Or is it 3:30?
3:30.
3:30. So I would have time to do some more, or we can have questions. So I have a feeling that we don't have enough questions. So why don't we have a question? Serious questions now, not just passing questions. Yes.
Is there a clear distinction between an object and an object aggregate?
We hope so. It's very difficult to imagine a case where there would be no clear distinction, but I'll give you some starting points. So, conjoined twins. Once they've been separated, they are separate objects, two objects. While they are together, we sometimes like to say that they're, assuming that they're not conjoined and have a common brain, assuming that they have separate bodies, but they're conjoined at the hips. We're tempted to say that they are two persons. On the BFO point of view, they are one object. But there is a fiat boundary between the two of them, where the eventual separation will. So that's one example. There are many examples of cells which are in a similar situation, because every time a cell divides, it creates, first of all, a kind of dumbbell shape, and then there is a period of transition. So you have one cell division, and then you have two cells. And during the period of transition, it may not be clear whether you have an object or an object aggregate. So in biology, you do find cases where it's unclear, but usually it's clear, and that's because object aggregates usually are the sorts of things which we pick out of reality because we like to count things. Populations are object aggregates. Study subjects are object aggregates. Study subjects. Football teams, rock bands, orchestras. They're all object aggregates, and we pick them out because they play important social roles. Yes?
In that vein, I was like with the example of tomato. If the tomato is still like on the plant, the plant is the object, but not an aggregate of
good.
tomatoes.
So that's another good example of the same lines, but it brings up an issue. So you remember when I defined object, I said examples of object first kind were organisms, cells, and then there was some caution around the word organ. Are organs objects? And the reason is that organs, like tomatoes, are connected through branches or through conduits of various sorts to other parts of the body, so they're not really separate. They're like Siamese twins or like conjoined twins, but they are mostly separate. So the points of connection to other things are very tiny as a fraction of the total surface area of the organ. And so I count organs as objects. Now, a question which I'm exercised by at the moment is, are fetuses and embryos and fetuses objects? Is the newborn baby an object? Because the newborn baby, the very first seconds, is still connected to the mother. I think that the newborn baby is an object, because I think that the newborn baby is identical with the adult. I also think that the fetus, at least after gastrulation, is an object. But some people disagree. They think that the fetus is just a part of the mother, like organs. I'm supposed to write a response to somebody who has criticized my view that the fetus is an object because she thinks the fetus is a part of the mother.
So, I never thought of that before, but there seem to be a couple of classes in Buffo, so where instances can never escape from. But from other classes that's not the case, because like the case of the arm, so if you sever the arm from the body, then it ceases to instantiate via body part and it becomes object.
Yeah, and I have to say that the arm is not the arm once it's been cut off.
No, it's not. It was not instance of arm before, but it is this entity which has this identity, right? Reference tracking, I give it number one. Now number one is now instant part.
Are you just picking you're going to cut here and you're picking just this part?
Well, that doesn't matter, right?
It does matter, maybe.
No, okay, here. So I cut it here. So this number one is now instance of fiat body part.
So
we cut it and then becomes instant.
This is the tomato.
Yeah, exactly.
Example. The tomato and the arm are two different cases. If you pick the tomato, you're not damaging the tomato. The tomato is naturally pickable. It has a mechanism.
So the tomato is
but your arm is not pickable, as you will discover if we attempt to pick it. There's a real connection, and that means that what is an arm at one time, I think we have to say it's destroyed by being detached, and the result of detaching is anew. It's a kind of arm stake.
No. I was not
Like a
discussing
piece
of
of
whether it
meat.
is still an arm or not. What I was discussing is the fact that it transitions from fiat object
The
part
question is, what is the it? I'm not sure that there is an it.
this.
I need to know where it ends. This part is easier. This part is hard. But we...
Okay.
Yes?
Which means it doesn't have the answer, don't it?
About organ donation.
Yeah.
Like if you remove a kidney,
Yeah.
take that and place it in somebody
Yeah.
else's body. How does that become an object, and then would it become a part of an?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So I think that the kidney is maybe in part as a result of modern day surgical practices, more like a tomato and less like an arm. And maybe the brain will become more like a tomato. The head, if they do the head, they can do the arm too. I'm not sure where this is leading.
They're doing the face.
Yes.
They're doing arms.
They're doing arms too.
Well, yes?
Well, I was just thinking, is this very different from taking a watch and replacing the battery? It seems like we have, like, in terms of, I have body parts that are part of me, but I could give my kidney to John,
Yeah.
and it becomes his body part. And we don't really have a problem saying, like, oh, if I take my watch apart and I replace this gear, that at one point, that gear may have been a part of a different watch, and now it goes into this watch.
Yeah.
Shouldn't that just be
So
the same?
these questions are philosophical questions which have been argued about for 2,000 years, and I don't like to try and solve problems which have not been solved to everybody's satisfaction after 2,000 years. So I don't want us to go down a metaphysical rabbit hole. So we are reaching the limits where we can be really coherent about these things. And we're trying really hard to be coherent. But if we want to know whether a kidney is more like a tomato or more like an arm, I think that even with modern day surgery, the arm and the head case are different from the kidney case. I think there's still a difference. And I think the watch is like the tomato. This is beginning to be a really strange conversation. The watch is more like, or rather the battery in the watch is more like a tomato. It's deliberately engineered to be pickable. Evolution and farmers have deliberately engineered the tomato to be pickable. With the kidney, we're reaching the limits of what is pickable within the organism. But we will, in the end, have the possibility of doing the head and the arm in almost as good a way as we can do the kidney. But I still don't think that will mean that the arm and the head are pickable.
But the important part is when you have difficult problems like that, is it possible to make a choice and a consistent choice within your rubber ontology? And I think with Buffalo you can do that. I mean,
yeah, we can do it, but we're going to have to work really hard about defining pickable, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
And we do. I am making an attempt at this in this paper about the baby as a part of the mother. So she thinks that the baby is part of the mother, and therefore she has the right to abort the baby, just as she would have the right to give up her kidney. And I say the baby is not a part of the mother, the baby is contained inside the mother, and the mother serves as a protecting environment for them.
But it would be easy if you don't use in the different stages words which are generally used in only particular stage. So don't use the baby, but say that thing at that time.
Yeah, she uses the baby.
Okay.
I use fetus and embryo.
Okay.
embryo and fetus.
Any more questions? Yes.
A question about something you said earlier.
Yeah.
So you said that BFO allows for both stocks and flows perspectives.
Yes.
How should we understand this in relationship to the distinction between occurrence and continuance?
So if you take the stocks perspective, you're only looking at the continuance in the world. You ignore the process. If you take the flows perspective, you only look at the occurrence, you ignore the continuum. So, and there are some people who do that. They do process metaphysics. Some parts of physics focus just on waves, not on particles.
So it doesn't mean that the very same entity can be...
No. It means you can view the world through two different spectacles. BFO is trying to view the world through spectacles which see, or which allow to be visible, both continuance and occurrence. So we are bi-categorical ontology in that sense. We're both continuance and occurrence. It's easier to be a monocategorical ontology, to be philosophically consistent. But we want to have our cake and the eating of it too. Yes?
I'm having a little trouble understanding why, at least based on the definition in the book, something like sight isn't a dependent continuum. Because it seems like it depends on some material entity.
Yeah, so this is a question which I get a lot. So let's try another case. Suppose you have an apple, and there is a metaphysically very powerful maggot in the middle of the apple, and it's eating away the apple from the inside. So gradually, as it eats more and more of the inside of the apple, you reach a point where you just have a very thin remainder of the apple. It still looks like an apple from the outside, but it's completely hollow. But the maggot keeps eating. Now, eventually, it's a very talented maggot. It can eat right up to the edge. Eventually, you'll only have the edge. And then a split second later, it will all disappear because the edge is practically infinitely thin. Do you think the edge is dependent on the rest? Or do you think it's the rest of the rest? In other words, the remainder. It's still the rest. It's still apple-y. It's not attributed. It's still that which the maggot has not yet managed to eat. Now, if you get that, then what is a sight? Well, it's what happens if you take away what you get if you take away gradually what filled the sight previously. So you have dirt in the ground. You take away the dirt, and it was there before. It just wasn't a hole. It was filled hole. So it's not dependent. Another way in which you can view these matters is the following. So why are boundaries not dependent upon the things they bound in the way in which attributes are dependent on the things they bound? Aristotle talked about things having different degrees of being. So substances have the maximal degree of being. Accidents have a much lesser degree of being. I think boundaries have just the same degree of being as the substances they bound, because whenever the substance is there, boundary is there. So sights, I think, also have the same degree of being. Whenever you're there, your mouth, the interior of your mouth. That's just the way I am. That's the way BFO is. We use dependence only for where there is a difference in degree of being. But no one really likes that terminology, and you won't find it in the book either, because it sounds old-fashioned.
Question on that note, like if there is a state which there are two adjacent states, and a part of that state goes to a different state, the boundary moves from one place to another.
Yep.
So it is defined by the state being going to a different state. So
I'm not sure how we would describe this. So I think that we can say that when the Second World War came to an end and Germany was forced to yield territory to Poland, then either we can say that the boundary of Germany moved west, or we can say that the boundary between Germany and Poland was redrawn. And I'm not sure that, I'm just not sure which. I think I prefer the second reading. But there are cases where immaterial entities can move. So I talked about the sheets, the bed sheets, when you climb into bed, and if you if you move around while you're asleep, then the hole, the site which you've created under the sheets is moving throughout the night. One and the same hole with an H is moving. And then what happens if there is a book called Holes, which was written by some of the people who were involved in the early work on BFO. And one of the puzzles they talk about is whether whether a hole could disappear and then come back again, the same hole, or whether it would have to be a different hole. So you imagine an air bubble under a carpet, and so the air bubble moves across the carpet for whatever reason, and then anyway, they consider a series of puzzles.
It can be explained by the relation of time. Like, with time, things change. So the boundaries are redrawn based on relation to time.
Yeah, well, that's what the Poland-Germany case was all about. For a certain period of time, the boundaries of Germany were here. For the next period of time, the boundaries of Germany were there. But that doesn't answer the question, your original question, whether it's the same boundary that moved or a new boundary. The old boundary died, as it were. And the book is about puzzles like that, not just for boundaries, but for whole. So I guess an example would be, you have a glass which has transparent jelly inside it, and there is two kinds of jelly, pink jelly and blue jelly, and there is an air bubble which moves from the pink side to the blue side. So in the first part, it's a bubble in the pink side, the second cup. Now, is it the same hole or is it a different hole? Well, you're tempted to say it's the same hole because it moves it moves gradually across the boundary. So there's no there's not the temptation to say it's the new hole, but you can have cases where there is a temptation to say that it's the new hole. So one of the authors of this book also wrote a book on shadows, which has. So if this rucksack of this laptop bag is creating a shadow here because of the light there, but there's also an apple here, then if is the apple also casting a shadow, or is there just one? Are there two shadows here? Both the shadow cast by the apple and also the shadow in the same place caused by the bag. So that turns out to be an interesting question. Trust me.
Yeah, for philosophers.
All right, so that's the end.